The components we find in the Sets tab are really the most important components, I think, in all of Grasshopper, because they're all about managing data, moving data around, splitting up data, and generally working on different lists and eventually lists of lists, which we call data trees. We're going to have specific chapters dedicated to lists and dedicated to data trees, but it's important to point out some of the components while we're here. Instead of starting over in list, I'm going to start in sequence. We have some really interesting components here which allow us to create different sequences of values and eventually do some things to those sequences, like remove certain elements from those sequences. To define what I mean, let's go ahead and start with set sequence and sequence. This component starts gray. I don't have any preview of any geometry on the canvas. What does it actually do? It takes a number of elements you want in the sequence, and it takes a character pool. In this case, we have the alphabet, English alphabet from A to Z. Let's see what we get. I'm going to go to params, input, panel. I seem to get a sequence of letters from A to J. I have 10 elements here because that's what I have in the input C. Though in P, I actually have 26 characters as defined by the English language. I have the first 10 characters of this character pool. Now we have a list of values. Let's see what else we can do with this list. So I'm going to go to sets list. The components here are to deal with lists. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to have another chapter dedicated to just looking at lists. But a couple of things. Let's say that I wanted to reverse the order of this list. So instead of going from A to J, I go from J to A. Well, I can go here to sets list, reverse list. Reverse the order of a list. Let's see what that looks like. I'm going to plug it here, then I'll plug it into the result. We've just flipped the list over, and we've done it with this very basic component. I wanted to show you this for a few reasons. First of all, to just introduce what some of these components do, but also to introduce you to the fact that some of these simple operations are part of the inputs and outputs of all the components. Let me delete this one and show you what I mean. I'm going to plug this one back in. I'm actually going to right click on the output here. Notice that we have a few ways that we can modify the output. Look at that, we have reverse. If I do that, notice that I get this icon and my list is also reversed. This is going to appear as well in some of the inputs, and we'll talk about what some of the other things mean a little bit later on. We can simply reverse either with the component that I showed you before or by right-clicking on the output here and selecting reverse. I'm going to undo that. Let's say that I wanted to pick one thing from this list. I can go to sets list and list item. I'll plug my list into L and notice that the L has just this generic gray icon. Means that any kind of data that's in a list can be used here. The next input is the item index. Notice that the list on the left has values from 0 to eventually here 9 because I have 10 elements. So the index, the I input, is asking for that value. Which index from this list do you want? Let's say that I want 3. Here I'll just put that in a panel, I'll double click, I'll put a quotation and just type in 3, and what do I get? I get D, because D is the index 3 item on this list. Let's see what else we have here. I'm going to go to sets, list. As you can see, we have all sorts of other list components that we'll look at a little bit later. Let's look at dispatch. I'm going to plug my list into L, and in P, I have a pattern of how I want to dispatch these items. True, false, and that's going to repeat. The first item is going to be true, the second item is going to be false, meaning that we're going to get two lists of values. Let's look at what those lists look like. I have A coming out of the true, then B is coming out of false. Then C comes out of true, and D comes out of false. And it repeats this simple pattern in P over and over again until the list is complete. So this is a way to split lists. Later on, we're going to look at how we can actually analyze a list of values and eventually pass things true or false and split it up into things that meet our criteria and things that do not meet our criteria. Here in set, we also have weave, which would allow us to weave this back together. Now we have the original list back again. A couple of other notable components here. We have things like range and series, which eventually are two ways to create values. So lists of values. In range, we have two inputs, a domain and a number of elements, and I get there a list of numbers. Because my domain goes from 0 to 1, that's the D input, I get values from 0 to 1. We also have random. It allows us to generate a random list of values. Let's take a look at that. I have the domain of the numeric range that I want. By default, it's from 0 to 1. Then the number of random values, and eventually the random seed. Let's put a panel there to see what we get. Params input panel. I get the number 0.771094. Did you get the same number? So then are you wondering why this is a random number generator? Random numbers, well, that's for a whole nother screencast, I suppose. But here we have that seed value. And as long as all of our seed values are the same, we're going to get the same random numbers. Let's expand this a little bit. Let's say that instead of one random number, I wanted to get several. So here I will make a slider that goes from 0 to 10. If I move that up to 10, notice that I get 10 random numbers. Let's create a different domain. So instead of going from 0 to 1, let's make it go from 0 to 10. I'll make a panel, start with a quotation, and write 0 to 10. Press enter. Now I have 10 values from 0 to 10. You probably have the same ones. If we change the random seed, then we could start to play with that a little bit more. If I right click in the center, I have another option. And I also want to introduce this to you because some components do have other behavior that we can evaluate if we right click in the center and see what we can have. In this case, if we right click, we see this integer numbers option. And if I click on that, notice that now, first I get a tag that's telling me that I've chosen something else than the default behavior, and I get just a list of random integers instead of random real numbers. Let's go ahead and select these two. I'm going to Control C, Control V to copy and paste them. And still, we get the same output. It's not going to by default generate new random numbers. We have to actually change the random seed. So let's go ahead and plug in the 10 into S to generate another random list. Both of us, if we did that, will have the same two sets of random lists. Anyways, we have two lists of random numbers now. If we go to sets and eventually sets, we have some components that are quite interesting, and you can use them to compare different sets of data. For example, let's go to sets and create set. I'm going to plug in the result of this list of random numbers, and I'm going to also join that with this other list. So remember, to do that, we have to get our cable and press shift so we can add a connection to the input. And let's look at the result. What I have here is actually a set of the unique values from both of the lists. Here I have 9 unique values. 8 shows up and 10 shows up, and it's showing me that between the two lists, what are only the unique values and nothing extra. This is useful to compare to make sure that you have in several lists a very definitive set. They're pretty interesting components to use. Next here we have text. Let's look quickly at what we can do here with text. Let's say that I wanted to take all of these random values and join them together, and I can use some kind of fragment here, a separator, to join them. Let's say a comma. Double click on the canvas, quotations, and add a comma. I can plug that into J. Now I get all of those numbers separated by a comma. This is all sorts of stuff to deal with text. Finally, we have the tree tab. We're going to have a specific chapter just dealing with trees because it's a very important part. Trees are lists of lists.